Hello viewers, welcome to K Diagnostics, Dio here. Today we have a 2014 Lincoln MKT with a 3.7 liter. The customer complaint on this vehicle is the check engine light remains on the dash while the engine is running. The owner of this vehicle is one of my subscribers, Mr. Syed. I want to give a shout out to Mr. Syed for bringing his vehicle to us. Mr. Syed found me on YouTube. He sent me an email. We emailed each other back and forth. I sent him the shop address, and after that he decided to bring his vehicle to us. He drove all the way from New York to bring his vehicle to us so we can look at it. When he got here, he mentioned that the vehicle was at another shop, and at the other shop they tried to fix it. They replaced the mass airflow sensor, the inlet tube that goes between the air filter box and the throttle body, and they also replaced the upstream O2 sensors. Okay, after replacing these parts, the vehicle was still not fixed. The check engine light came back. He took it back to that shop, and the mechanic at the other shop told him to drive the vehicle for 100,000 miles, and after that the check engine light would go off. So that's silly, right? He went on YouTube, he found me, he emailed me, and now here we are. So the first thing we're gonna do is I'm going to show you the parts that were replaced under the hood, and after that we're gonna go in the vehicle and confirm the customer's complaint. So now I'm going to open the hood. Let me show you all the parts that were replaced. Actually, this hood doesn't stay up. The hood struts are worn out on this vehicle. So I'm gonna show you the parts that were replaced at the other shop. So they replaced the mass airflow sensor. As you can see, the mass airflow sensor is new. The connector looks good. They replaced this inlet tube. As you can see, it's new. They also replaced the O2 sensor. The oxygen sensor over here is new. Let me remove this engine cover. So both upstream O2 sensors were replaced right there. So the connector looks new. As you can see, that sensor is new. Okay, so they replaced all these components, but the vehicle is still not fixed. Now let's go in the vehicle and confirm the customer's complaint. So right there, as you can hear, the engine is running and the check engine light remained on the dash. So right there. So customer's complaint confirmed. So here is our problem. So the check engine light indeed remains on the dash, and the customer says that the vehicle seems to drive fine. So I'm going to turn off the engine. I'm going to turn the key on. I'm going to get the scan tool connected to the vehicle. After I get the scan tool connected to the vehicle, I'll bring you guys back up so we can scan the engine control unit. Alright guys, I got the scan tool connected to the vehicle. I'm gonna bring it up here. So we're gonna scan the engine computer. So right there, the scan tool has identified the vehicle, 2014 Lincoln MKT with a 3.7 liter. So everything looks good. We're gonna click OK. Let's do a code scan. Let's scan all the control units on the vehicle and see what we got. Here's what we got. We have two trouble codes in the engine computer, P0171-00, and it says System 2 Lean Bank 1. And the second trouble code is P0174-00, and it says System 2 Lean Bank 2. And we have the same trouble codes in the transmission control unit, P0171 and P0174. This is probably because the transmission control unit is part of the engine computer. Okay, so let's scroll down and see what else we have. We have one trouble code in the ABS control unit. We have two trouble codes in the steering column control module. We have two codes on the generic side of the tool, P0171, System 2 Lean Bank 1, and P0174, System 2 Lean Bank 2. So these two codes over here are causing the check engine light to remain on while the engine is running. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna focus on the engine computer. Now, a System 2 Lean means the engine is running with more air and less fuel. Okay, since these codes are set for both banks, that means bank 1 and bank 2 are running lean, so they're running with more air and less fuel. And this can be caused by a vacuum leak, low fuel pressure, or a defective mass airflow sensor. Okay, so the air-fuel ratio is imbalanced. There is more air going into the engine, and the computer is opening the injectors long enough to try to compensate for that excess air. Okay, and we're gonna see that in the fuel trim numbers. We're gonna diagnose this by looking at fuel trim numbers. We're gonna start the engine and watch our fuel trim numbers. On an engine that doesn't have an issue, our fuel trim numbers should be 10%, plus or minus 10%. So that's total trim, short term and long term. Okay, so I'm going to click on engine. We're gonna look at live data, and our fuel trim numbers will give us an idea of what's causing the lean code on this engine. Actually, before we look at data, I wanna look at freeze frame. So we're gonna go to generic functions. I wanna look at what type of data the computer was receiving when this trouble code was set. So we have our trouble code over here, P0174. So we were in closed loop. Our engine temperature was 179 degrees. Our short-term bank 1 was 3.9%. Short-term bank 2 was 0.0. Okay. Our O2 sensor on bank 1, so the second O2 sensor, was showing 770 millivolts, and our calculated load was 36.5%. So that's good to know. Our engine speed was 595 RPMs, so this was set at idle, and the engine was at operating temperature. Our mass airflow sensor grams per second was 3.82 grams per second. Our long-term fuel trim bank 1 was 22.7, and our long-term fuel trim bank 2 was 29.7%. So these long-term fuel trim numbers are too high. Remember, I said on a good engine, our fuel trim numbers should be plus or minus 10%. So we have high positive numbers over here, which tells me that the computer is adding more fuel to try to compensate for the excess air that this engine is receiving. So we have to determine that. So our vehicle speed was 0, so the vehicle was stationary. So this is good to know. So now we're gonna back out and look at live data. So I'm gonna go to the generic side of the tool. We're gonna go to display current data. We're gonna customize this list. We're only gonna look at data PIDs that will help us diagnose this problem. So we're gonna grab our engine speed, fuel system, engine temperature, mass airflow sensor data PID, short-term and long-term fuel trim, O2 sensors. So that's all. Now we're gonna list these PIDs. I'm gonna start the engine. We're gonna focus on our fuel trim numbers, short term and long term, okay? After starting the engine, I'm going to increase the engine RPMs. If our fuel trim numbers get better when our engine RPM is high, that will tell me that our issue is a vacuum leak. So now I'm gonna start the engine. So we're still in open loop. We're gonna wait until we go into closed loop, and we're gonna watch these fuel trim numbers. So we are in closed loop. Our short-term fuel trim numbers are positive right now. So we have 9% on short-term bank 1, 9% on bank 2 short-term. Let's look at long-term. Long-term bank 1 is 23.4% and bank 2 is 27.3%. So now I'm going to increase the engine RPMs to 4,000 RPMs. So let's watch these numbers. So 4,000 right there. Check out our fuel trim numbers. So short term we have negative, so low numbers here. But our long-term fuel trim numbers are super high. So we have high positive numbers on the long term. Okay, so these fuel trim numbers are not getting better at high RPMs. So I'm gonna let off. So we have normal numbers on the short term, but we have high positive numbers on the long term. So this tells me that our problem is not the vacuum leak. So we can already rule out the vacuum leak out of the picture. So now we are left with the mass airflow sensor and fuel delivery. The next thing I'm gonna do is, since the mass airflow sensor was replaced at the other shop, I'm going to graph my O2 sensors. And then I'm gonna increase the engine RPMs again. What we have to do now is we have to watch for a rich signal on these O2 sensors, okay? So now I'm gonna increase my engine RPMs. So we should see a rich signal on these O2 sensors. So on the O2 sensors after the catalytic converter, this one over here is showing 760 millivolts. It went down to 755 millivolts. So this is a rich signal over here, okay? And this one also is showing us 780 and 90 millivolts. So that's good. And these ones up here are going between positive or negative milliamps. So that's good. Okay, so based on the numbers that I see over here, especially on the O2 sensors after CAT, these numbers tell me that our fuel delivery is most likely good, okay? Because we have a solid, rich signal on these O2 sensors here. Now, we could have O2 sensors that are not working properly, and defective O2 sensors can also cause lean codes to be set. Now, I'm gonna try to drive these O2 sensors lean. Let's see how quickly they're gonna respond to the oxygen content in the exhaust stream. So I'm gonna do that by pumping the brake pedal. I don't know if you can see my foot down there. So as I'm pumping, so right now we have a rich signal on these two O2 sensors. Okay, this voltage should drop. So I'm gonna keep pumping. Let's see if we can drive these O2 sensors lean. If we can, that will tell me that these O2 sensors are most likely good. So right there. So you see this drop over here. Okay. You see the drop in voltage even up here. Okay, so we dropped down to 165 millivolts. So this is a lean mixture in the exhaust stream. Okay, so this tells me that our O2 sensors are working. Okay, so if our O2 sensors are working and our fuel delivery seems fine, what is the issue? Okay, what is the problem, guys? So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to graph my mass airflow sensor. Okay, so at idle, my mass airflow sensor value is 3.6 grams per second, which is good because this is a 3.7 liter engine. Okay, the engine size is 3.7. The rule of thumb is the mass airflow sensor value at idle should be close to the engine size. So if you have a 3.7 liter engine, your mass airflow sensor should be around 3.6 or 3.7 grams per second, which is kind of close to it. Okay, and this, I believe, only applies on engine that have an engine size of over 3 liter. Okay, I mean, I could be wrong, but basically the rule of thumb is if you have a engine that has an engine size of over 3 liter, your mass airflow sensor value at idle should be close to the engine size. So I'm gonna snap it. Let's watch the value here on the mass airflow sensor PID. Okay, so we saw a big jump here. Now, the mass airflow sensor is new. At this point, we know we don't have a vacuum leak. Our mass airflow sensor is most likely working unless it's a bad quality mass airflow sensor. We know this sensor was replaced. So we are down to fuel pressure. Okay, knowing that our fuel trim numbers are not getting better regardless of engine speed, okay, our problem is most likely fuel pressure. Okay, I know that the signal we saw on the O2 sensor looked good. Okay, we have good voltage on the O2 sensors, but I'm going to go under the hood and check fuel pressure first because of these numbers I have here. Okay, so when you have fuel trim numbers that are positive high regardless of engine speed, the issue is most likely a fuel delivery problem. Okay, so long-term bank 1 we have 25% at idle, and long-term fuel trim bank 2 we have 28.9% at idle. This is too high. Okay, this engine is running lean. So now I'm going to get the scan tool out of the way. I'm going to turn off the engine. Let's go under the hood and do a fuel pressure measurement. Okay, we're going to use a fuel pressure gauge and check our fuel pressure under the hood. So let's go under the hood and do that. So we're gonna measure our fuel pressure. Now, I did look up the fuel pressure spec on this vehicle. The fuel pressure spec is 55 psi with the key on, engine off, and the pressure should go up with the engine running. So with the engine running, our fuel pressure should be between 55 psi and 65 psi. So I'm going to put this pig mat down here. Now, this engine doesn't have a service port, so the fuel system here doesn't have a service port. I looked around this fuel rail. There's no service port around it. We're gonna have to disconnect this line and tap into this fuel supply line so we can measure our fuel pressure. So I'm going to disconnect this fuel line over here. Actually, I'm gonna wear my eye protection first. So I got my eye protection on. We're gonna carefully disconnect this line. There will be fuel coming out. So our fuel is falling on this pig mat over here. Now it looks like we have good pressure here because we have a lot of fuel leaking out. Now you have to be careful when you do this because this can be very dangerous. All right, so we got that line completely disconnected. I'm gonna get my pig mat out of the way. Now we're gonna connect our adapters into the lines that we have on the vehicle. Now we're gonna connect our pressure gauge to these adapters. All right, so we have to make sure everything is connected well because we don't want any leaks. Now, since I'm working by myself, I'm going to feed my pressure gauge behind the hood so that I can see it when I start the engine. We're gonna watch our fuel pressure from inside the vehicle. Okay, so we got our gauge connected. So now let's go in the vehicle and start the engine. So here's what we got. We're gonna watch our fuel pressure when we start the engine. Our fuel pressure, key on engine off, should go up to 55 psi. Okay, so that's the spec on this vehicle. So I'm going to turn the key on. So I'm gonna have you watch the gauge as I'm turning the key on. So the key is on in the vehicle. So look at that. Key is on and our fuel gauge did not move. So this is not a good sign. So let's cycle the key. I'm gonna cycle the key. So watch the gauge over there. I'm cycling the key. So our fuel gauge is not moving. Okay, so we have found the problem, guys. So now I'm gonna start the engine. Let's see. It's building pressure now. So our fuel pressure went up to 60 psi initially, and now it's dropping. Oh, this is the problem, guys. We have low fuel pressure. So our problem is low fuel pressure. We have about 33 psi right now. So 33 psi at idle is really low. Let me rev it up. Oh, you see the fuel pressure drop? Oh yeah, this is the problem. That's your problem, sir. We got low fuel pressure. So this is what's causing our fuel trim numbers to be high positive. And this is what's causing the lean codes to be set in the engine computer. We don't have enough fuel pressure for this engine. Now I'm gonna turn off the engine. I'm gonna cycle the key again. So key is cycled. Our fuel pressure is still low. I'm gonna start the engine. Fuel pressure goes up and then it's gonna start dropping. All right, so that's it. It's a wrap, guys. This is a problem. We have low fuel pressure. Okay, so this pressure here is abnormal. This is too low for this engine to run. Now, the interesting thing is the owner of this vehicle told me that the vehicle was running fine. Like it wasn't surging, it wasn't losing power, everything was fine. Okay, the only issue was the check engine light that was remaining on. Okay, but this fuel pressure here is really low. All right, guys, we have figured out the problem with this engine. This engine has a fuel delivery problem. The fuel pressure going to the injectors is too low. Now, we're gonna do one more test before we call for a fuel pump. We're gonna check our fuel pump power and our fuel pump ground. We could have voltage drop in the fuel pump wiring, and that can cause the fuel pressure to be low in the system. Now, we have two types of fuel systems on these vehicles. Some of them are mechanical and other ones are electronic. On the mechanical systems, there is a regulator that regulates the fuel pressure in the system. And sometimes those regulators leak fuel in the tank, which causes the fuel pressure to be low. So that's something we have to keep in the back of our minds. But I'm not gonna worry about that, because even if our system has a regulator, if the regulator is the problem, I'm gonna go ahead and replace the entire fuel pump assembly, which is gonna come with a new regulator. Because if this system has a regulator, and if the regulator is bad, the pump will eventually go bad. So I'm gonna go ahead and replace the whole unit, okay? Just for warranty purposes, I'm not just gonna replace the regulator, I might as well replace the whole thing, because I don't wanna replace the regulator and then have this vehicle come back a month or two back here to the shop with the same issue, okay? So if it has a regulator, it's getting a whole fuel pump unit. But before we call for the fuel pump unit, let's make sure we have good power and good ground at the fuel pump. So let me figure out how we're gonna get access to the fuel pump electrical connector, and then I'll bring you guys back up. Here's our fuel pump assembly. This is our fuel pump control module. So this module controls the fuel pump. So we're gonna have to check these two wires at the fuel pump electrical connector, okay? So this yellow wire with the gray tracer and this white wire with the brown tracer, okay? So I'm gonna figure out how we can access the fuel pump assembly, and after that I'll bring you guys back up so we can check these two wires at the fuel pump assembly. Hopefully we can get access to this fuel pump assembly from under the back seat inside the vehicle, okay? I'm gonna figure that out and then I'll bring you guys back up. I looked under the back seat to see if we can access the fuel pump from inside the vehicle, but there is no access. I even lifted this carpet here. I could see the round form of where the fuel pump is, but there's no access. So we're gonna have to lift up the vehicle and drop the fuel tank so we can get access to the fuel pump assembly, okay? So I'm gonna put the vehicle on the lift so we can drop the fuel tank. Here is our fuel tank. Since we wanna do one more test before we drop the tank, I see an electrical connector over here that goes to the fuel pump. So this connector is gonna have our fuel pump wiring on it. This connector over here has two heavy gauge wires, and I believe these wires are the fuel pump wires. If you look closely here, I don't know if I can show you, there is a yellow wire with a black tracer, and then there is a gray wire with a brown tracer. And these two heavy gauge wires are the fuel pump wires. So I'm going to back probe them. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna load test the fuel pump circuit. All right, so I got both fuel pump wires back probed. We're gonna use this headlight bulb to load the fuel pump circuit. So I'm going to connect them to our back probing tools over here. Just like that. And then I'm gonna put my headlight bulb over here. So I'm gonna turn on the pump using the scan tool. When I turn on the pump, if this light turns on nicely and brightly, that will tell me that we don't have voltage drop on the fuel pump circuit. And at that point, I'm gonna feel comfortable replacing the fuel pump assembly. So now I'm gonna turn on the fuel pump with the scan tool. Right there. As you can see, our headlight bulb comes on nicely and brightly, and I can hear the fuel pump run in the tank. So that's good. The fact that this headlight bulb comes on nicely and brightly that tells me that our fuel pump circuit is good. Okay, we don't have voltage drop in the fuel pump circuit. So at this point, I feel comfortable dropping the fuel tank and replacing the fuel pump assembly. I'm gonna drop the fuel tank off camera, and then I'll bring you guys back up so we can replace the fuel pump assembly.